Aguinush, Tafalja Road, Kildare. You're very, very welcome. My name is Brian Howley. I'm Chairman of Balbriggan and District Historical Society. I'm delighted this evening to introduce one of our founding members, Jim Walsh, local historian and retired librarian. The sack of Balbriggan happened 100 years ago, and Balbriggan Historical Society are very committed to commemorating this tragic event in a respectful and dignified manner. We had numerous events planned along with various local groups and clubs and Fingal County Council. Unfortunately, this largely fell apart because we all know about the global pandemic of COVID-19 and the restrictions introduced to minimise the loss of life. So naturally we are saddened by this. However, we are putting our best foot forward, and as part of Heritage Week, we are now moving into the virtual world. I'm bringing Jim Walsh into the virtual world. Earlier on in the year, we had our very successful calendar, and this was very, very well received. And we are now providing the eagerly awaited Sack of Balbriggan talk by Jim Walsh. We were meant to do this. This was meant to be in March and then reprieved here for Heritage Week. And Jim has a lot of more updated research and new findings to present. We also are about to launch our new Sack of Balbriggan commemorative medal, which depicts the scene in Clonard Street of utter devastation, and we want to acknowledge the kind sponsorship of the Progressive Credit Union for that. Without further ado, I'll introduce you to Jim Walsh.
Thank you, Brian, for that very gracious introduction. At the outset of this presentation, I'd like to particularly thank the Present Committee of Balbriggan and District Historical Society. Without your help and encouragement, this presentation would not have come to fruition. And in particular, your technical wizard and current secretary, Killian Harford. Without him, I would not have been able to get the illustrated version proper. So I will be depending on Killian for the second part of tonight's presentation. But if I may, I would like to start with a short preamble for a few moments to put the Sack of Balbriggan into its historical context by speaking briefly about the Irish War of Independence itself, and then I'd like to paint a picture of Balbriggan and its townspeople from an economic, social and political outlook in 1920, prior to the events themselves. And then we go to about 65 PowerPoint images, and we'll give a narrative of the events as they occurred in the night as we go along. So hopefully, I'm just hoping that perhaps this presentation, because of the research that's gone into it, may be a little bit more nuanced and perhaps more objective than previous presentations. To begin, it is accepted by historians that the two most notorious reprisals of the Irish War of Independence were the sack of Balbriggan, 21st September 1920, and the burning of Cork City on the 12th of December of the same year. This war, which is also referred to as the Anglo-Irish War, and by the Republican candidates or combatants as the Tan War, it began with two unconnected but momentous events which occurred on the same day. At noon on Monday, the 21st of January 1919, members of the Tipperary North Brigade of Irish Volunteers ambushed the delivery of gelignite being delivered to Solahut Beg Quarry, not far from Tipperary town. Led by Sean Tracy and Dan Brian, the volunteers shot dead the two RIC escorts, namely Constables MacDonald and O'Connell. Later on the same day, the 1st Provisional Dáil Éireann met in the Mansion House in Dawson Street, Dublin. This historic meeting was attended by 27 of the 73 Sinn Féin candidates who had been elected in the landslide general election of December 1918. In Fingal, the sitting Irish Parliamentary Party member John Joseph Clancy, who had represented his constituency since 1885, was replaced by Frank Lawless from Saucerstown and Swords. He and his son Joseph had been involved at the Battle of Ashbourne in 1916. At the time of his election, Frank Lawless was actually incarcerated at Usk Prison in Wales. Unfortunately, his fellow swordsman, Richard Coleman, didn't fare so well because he died of the dreaded flu in the same year. Incidentally, by the way, the votes were cast and the results of the election were both announced in Balbriggan's Town Hall. At the time of his election, now, the Dáil issued a proclamation of independence and appointed Sean T. O'Kelly and George Gavin Duffy as envoys to the Paris Peace Conference recently convened in Versailles. They hoped to influence the major powers, principally the USA, into accepting the validity of the Dáil and that of the cause of Irish independence. Unfortunately, President Woodrow Wilson, who earlier had espoused the right of smaller nations to independence, concentrated his time on promoting a League of Nations, thus ending the dreams of the Dáil. Henceforth, a second meeting was convened in April, at which Eamon de Valera was pronounced president, after which he embarked on an 18-month tour of America to raise funds and to fight for the cause of Irish independence, leaving control in Ireland to Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy. And Richard Mulcahy at that time was actually in charge of the volunteer movement. Now, later that year, 1919, in August, the volunteers were asked to give an oath of allegiance and take an oath of allegiance to the Dáil, which they did, and henceforth they were known as the Irish Republican Army. Now, in late 1919 and early 1920, Collins and Mulcahy coordinated a plan of attack on the RIC. Established in 1822 and receiving the royal appellation in 1867, following their role in putting down the Fenian Rising of the same year, this police force were seen as the eyes and ears of the British administration in Ireland. Nominally responsible for the upkeep of law and order and quelling uprisings, they also fulfilled civic duties such as supervising census returns and weights and measures. And unfortunately, they also took part in levelling of houses and in evictions. The weekly returns from the district inspectors, including the district inspector based in Balbriggan, because Balbriggan was a district station, were considered a valuable resource for British intelligence. The RIC now became a subject of increasingly daily raids on the rural outposts and barracks, resulting eventually in the closure of many of such bases and the removal of the RIC personnel to fortified urban barracks such as Balbriggan and Swords. Now, these successful raids not only caused a rapid decrease in police morale, but also provided much needed provision of arms and munitions. Now we'll take a brief look at Balbriggan from the 1st of January 1920. We have a look at how the town was developing, how the people were coping. What was the economic situation as such? In fact, I often thought Balbriggan then could best be described as a thriving industrial seaside resort. The census of 1911 revealed that the population of Balbriggan resided in 507 houses and comprised of 2,273 people, as we colloquially say, squares into 507 houses. In essence, the town boundaries extended from the confluence of Hampton Street and Market Green to the Tambo houses in Drogheda Street. Now, as a coastal location, Balbriggan boasted of a working harbour, completed in the 1760s. A lighthouse completed in 1820. Salt works started by Samuel Payne in the 1700s, and in 1920 was run by a firm called McDonald's. A Coast Guard station overlooking the landscape, built in 1864. A sea baths house, which was actually based in the former Royal National Lifeboat Boathouse underneath the Martello Tower. But Balbriggan also could boast of a very impressive railway viaduct of 11 arches, designed by John McNeill and dating from 1844. Now, in 1920, Balbriggan had three very successful factories: a linen mill in Mill Street, run by the Gallen family since 1877, and two very large hosiery concerns, namely Smith & Company and Balbriggan Sea Mills Limited. The former, who traced their origins back to 1780, were famous not only for the quality of their products, but had moved to a new premises close to the railway station in 1867 in what we used to be called Freeman's Row. But they had to rebuild and extend their premises following a fire in 1882. Now, 2 years later, in 1884, a British firm, in an act of opportunity, shall we say, namely Deeds Temple & Sons, moved on to the sea banks and established a factory which they called Balbriggan Sea Mills Limited. The town could also boast of a market house, built as early as 1811, where annual and monthly fairs were held for many, many years. A courthouse built in George's Square in 1849. A new town hall opened in High Street in May 1905. And an impressive Carnegie Library, the first Carnegie Library built in Fingal, built by local contractor Michael Heaney in 1905. In January 1920, Smith and Company were doing so well, they decided to build a large new loom house attached to the factory. And Thomas Cashel wrote to the Balbriggan Rural District Council urging them to build new houses in the town in Balbriggan, stating that he felt confident that these new employees could afford to pay a rent of 10 shillings a week. And in March of that year, the town commissioners decided to build new houses in Hampton Street. Now for the politics of the town. January 1920 saw the first local elections in Ireland since 1914. The ensuing results of the town commission's election reflected a virtual sea change in the political sensitivities of the people of Balbriggan. Contrary to received opinion, Balbriggan was not a hotbed of republicanism. Local historians such as Barbara Curtis and Frank Werty, who have published articles on this subject, revealed that no one from Balbriggan was out in 1916. Bernard Howard, a Malahide-based local historian, contributed an article on the subject to the Fingal Studies in 2010, where he revealed that no less than 292 men from Balbriggan and surroundings enlisted in the British Army and Navy during World War I, and that 41 of these men perished. Indeed, a local company of volunteers was not formed until early 1970 in Balbriggan, mainly through the machinations, I suppose, of Jack Gaynor and Jimmy Derham, two local volunteers. Jack Gaynor was the first captain of the local company, and Jimmy Derham was the treasurer. Now, in 1917, as elsewhere, the membership temporarily increased. Actually, 1918, I should say. The membership of the volunteer companies throughout Ireland, and including Balbriggan, increased dramatically because of the threat of conscription in Ireland. And we have figures from Frank Werty's research that the numbers went from 32 to 68 and eventually to 200. But as soon as the threat of conscription receded, the numbers fell away again. Now, however, the local elections held in January 1920 showed a real change in the political leanings of the population as a whole and of the population of Balbriggan. And I'm indebted to current committee member Brian Kavanagh, who has made available the following findings from the records of Balbriggan Town Commissioners, which are held in Fingal Archives in Main Street, Swords. And they are as follows in alphabetical order. This is the 15th of January 1920. Michael Brady, Labour. Thomas Cashel, Unionist. Stephen Corry, Independent. Phil Curran, Labour. John Derham, Sinn Féin. Michael James Derham, or Jimmy Derham as he was known to his contemporaries, son of John Derham, Sinn Féin. Richard Gorman, Unionist. Archdale Graham, Nationalist, and James McLew, Sinn Féin. So 3 of the 9 new commissioners were Sinn Féin. And Jimmy Derham, the son of John Derham, at the tender age of 23, was the new town commissioner. Not only that, in June of 1920, there were elections to the board of Balbriggan Rural District Council, and there were seats available for 5 men in Balbriggan. And again, Michael Brady and Jimmy Derham were elected onto the board, along with Christopher Brown, Peter Carr, and Patrick Dunnigan. And we will now, in a few moments, begin our illustrated narrative. And I should say that the names of John Derham, Jimmy Derham, and one of the other men in question that I mentioned, Richard Gorman, Unionist, will feature as part of our illustrated presentation. Thank you. Well, now, folks, we begin our illustrated narrative. Killian and I thought that normally it's common when you're presenting a paper to society to give references and sources at the back, but I felt it might be pertinent to show a few of the sources that proved very, very useful in preparing this presentation for a study of this period. So I start with this magnificent tome that was described in one review. This huge tome was published in 2017 by Cork University Press. As you can see, it's called Atlas of the Irish Revolution. I counted 103 individual contributors from all parts of the island, north and south. There are over 900 pages of text, and that doesn't include references and index In the index, there are about 10 references to Balbriggan, and they all concern the sack of Balbriggan, so it's obviously a key document in itself. The second is the third of 3 books written by Michael B. Barry. It's The Fight for Irish Freedom, but it's illustrated. And Killian and I have taken images from both books as part of this presentation. Now, 3 documents again which prove very useful. This book on the left, The Black and Tans by Richard Bennett, for many years, when I go back to the formation of our society in 1981, there was literally nothing available on the sack of Balbriggan. Nobody had ever written a book. This is the only book that was written in the Black and Tans. It was years out of print. It was published in 1959 and wasn't reprinted until 1995. It features about 2 pages on the sack of Balbriggan and has one iconic photograph looking down Clonard Street. But it's a valuable book to know about, and it's nice to know it's back in print. This book in question in the middle is now out of print. It was a nice, concise little book that produced some years ago by Brendan Matthews, a native of Stamullen, a community historian of note attached to Millmount Museum in Drogheda. And he came into possession that year of a collection of invoices or bills belonging to a family called Mitchell in Stamullen, representing goods bought from various business premises in Balbriggan, and one such is featured on the front cover, and they feature throughout the book. The photograph that you can see is of Clonard Hill looking down over Balbriggan. I found the first chapters in his book particularly useful in depicting events that were happening in Balbriggan up to the sack of Balbriggan, because at the time he was involved in a project indexing the Drogheda Independent according to subject. And it is out of print, unfortunately, but it's worth knowing about as such. The book on the right-hand side, some of you may have read recently. It was published in 2017 by O'Brien Press. As you can see, it's called Pawns, Ireland's War of Independence. One wrong move could prove fatal. It's actually ostensibly written for young adults or teenagers. But I read it in one reading and I found it absolutely wonderful. I recommend it to adults of all ages. It's set in Balbriggan in 1920, and the story is actually wonderful. It features a young boy called Tommy Dunn, an ex-orphan who gets a job in the hotel called the Mill Hotel, which I take is loosely based on the Hamilton Arms Hotel, which is the site of the present Brackencourt Hotel. He joins the local band. He gets a job as a boot boy. He befriends 2 girls. One is the daughter of the owner of the hotel, and the second is a girl called Stella Radcliffe, who was a daughter of the officer in command of Gormanstown Aerodrome. But he also comes under the influence of a mysterious whiskey salesman called O'Shea, who inveigles Tommy into eavesdropping on conversations between officers in the hotel while drinking and reporting back. I won't spoil the story, but it's an absolutely marvellous work. Now on the left, some of you might remember this particular item. Back in 1992, committee member Tommy Coughlin and I, with his daughter Elaine, we interviewed 3 senior citizens who were alive at the time of the sack of Balbriggan, and we introduced each person for an hour. And they were Michael Hammond, Mrs. McGilvery, and Mrs. Daly from Flemington Lane. And we decided to sell it to the public for £10 at a time. It was an hour long, and it also featured a song specially written by local musician Maxie McAvoy. And as the credits roll, his song rolls out. And over the years, we sold about 300 copies, but eventually the sound began to deteriorate, so we ceased that. But every year in September, as part of our autumn programme, we show this in the Milestone, initially on a big television. It was a VCR cassette. But when the Brackencourt opened here for the first year, we availed of the pull-down screen in the original function room, and a huge crowd turned up. It was so warm, I went across to the central. I had a pint of water and watched the match. At 10 minutes to go, I stood in the hallway, and Mrs. Daly from Flemington Lane was on the screen singing the sack of Balbriggan in a wonderful singing voice. That's why we chose her. Ironically, she was singing the ballad of the sack of Balbriggan to the tune of Kevin Barry. And ironically again, Kevin Barry, a medical student at the age of 18, was arrested in Church Street, after an abortive attack on unarmed military cadets who were collecting bread from Church Street. He was arrested exactly on the same day as the sack of Balbriggan, the 20th September 1920. The item on the right-hand side is a photograph of the title page of a document which is not in the public domain. This is a local lady called Mary Fogarty, who completed this thesis as part of Bachelor of Arts degree for Dublin City University in 2009-2010. But I was able to help her with some primary sources, and when she completed it, she presented me with a personal copy. And it's now part of the archives, obviously, of Balbriggan District Historical Society. She was probably one of the first people to avail in Ireland of the testaments or statements recorded between 1947 and 1957 throughout Ireland of male and female people who participated in the Irish War of Independence, who survived and were ready to talk. They were under lock and key for 50 years in military archives, were only released in hard copy to the general populace in March of 2003, and now in the last few years are available online. And she was able to go to certain two very, very important and unique accounts, which are now part of that bureau or that archive, both relating specifically to the events of the sack of Balbriggan. One was the testament of Jack Gaynor, officially John Henry Gaynor, known to his contemporaries as Jack or the Munchie Gaynor, and who was the first company captain of the local company of volunteers. While he was not directly involved in the events of September of 1920, the rest of his story is quite unique. And in fact, 2 years earlier, at the age of 19, he reveals in his testament recorded in 1955, he was one of that group chosen by Cathal Brugha to travel to London, and should the Act of Conscription have been passed by the English King, they were to take out various members of the British Cabinet individually. And in fact, that when he was in England, Jack Gaynor pulled the short straw and had to travel to Wales to stalk the home address of the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, in case he was home at the time. As we know, of course, the King did not sign the Act of Conscription, and the men were eventually brought home by Michael Collins. And of course, people like Jack Gaynor were sworn to secrecy. They could never talk about it. Now, while he wasn't directly involved in the sack of Balbriggan, he was involved directly in a similar incident that occurred some months previously on Clonard Street in 1920, which resulted in the death of an RSC sergeant called Sergeant Finnerty. We'll refer to that later on in our narrative. Now, Killian and I, we saw this diagram, and it comes from page 580 of the Atlas of the Irish War of Independence. It's part of an article contributed by an historian called Marie Coleman, and she lectures in Queen's University, Belfast. And we're going to use this as part of our narrative of the events that happened in the night in Balbriggan. So we're starting with the very lower building here, and that was Smith's Public House, just on George's Square. The building is still there. Over the years it was known as Patton's and John Dee's, etc. Building has hardly changed. It was owned by a Mrs. Mary Smith. She had a shop and a bar. And according to newspapers at the time, she closed the shop at about 8 o'clock and went into the bar to help her daughter. And sometime afterwards, a taxi or car arrived from Dublin with several RIC members, including 2 RIC officers. One, Peter Burke, age 33, head constable, expecting another rise or promotion to district inspector. He was in civilian clothes, as was his brother, William Patrick, who was sergeant in charge of weights and measures. Now, Peter Burke was a very well-known and popular instructor of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries in the Phoenix Park. And it said he was on the way out to Gormanstown military camp, because from August onwards, incoming Black and Tans and auxiliaries were based in the camp. Now, the sources differ. When she was interviewed by the Irish Times, Mary Smith said that it would appear that there were some Black and Tans in the bar as well. The Black and Tans were in the habit of coming into Balbriggan at 7:15 off the train taking their drink and heading back on the 10:15 train to Gormanstown railway station. So, for whatever reason, Mary Smith decided to refuse drink to all of the parties concerned. She sent word down to the RIC personnel, who are then based in the barracks just a few yards down the road on Bridge Street. They arrived, and for whatever reason, they declined to intervene and promptly left. Now, at this stage, a number of men were drinking in Connolly's public house in the corner of Mill Street. One was Michael Rock, and Michael Rock was probably the most important man or volunteer in the area. His deposition was taken in April 1956, and he was reared in Dunall. He received his education in Dunall. He was a member of the Gaelic League, Sinn Féin, a noted hurler, and the first company captain in Dunall. But eventually, in 1920, he was aged 34. He was the leader of the Dunall battalion of the volunteers throughout this part of Fingal. And in his deposition, he tells us that the reason he was in Balbriggan on that particular Monday night, it was almost serendipity. He says that some days previous, or weeks previously, to September the 20th, he'd organised what he called a flapper sports meeting in a field close to Gormanstown railway station. The funds were ostensibly for the Republican cause, but he couldn't publicise it. And he said, ironically, that most of the contestants were black and tans from the nearby camp. And he said on the night he was in Connolly's to pay expenses to Jimmy Derham, the treasurer, and other people who had helped him out. Now, sitting drinking with him was the second lieutenant of the local volunteers, a local man called Willie Corcoran. Willie Corcoran was 22 years of age at the time, living in Clonard Street with 6 siblings and his widowed mother Annie, who also had a dairy. Now, we're very lucky because in 1978 I had the privilege of taping the reminiscences of Willie Corcoran while he was living in his daughter's house, Mrs. Delahoy in Clonard Street. He was then aged 80. It's only 20 minutes long, but it's wonderful to be able to compare both versions. There are differences, and I'm not going to concentrate on them as part of this presentation, but they are invaluable records, and they are the 2 main protagonists on the night. In his own words, actually, Willie Corcoran said, "I was drinking with Mick Rock when 2 men, Jack Gilday and John Thompson, came in and said," and his exact wording was, "There's murder up in the bar," meaning there was a kerfuffle up in Mary Smith's bar. Somewhat prophetic words, if I may say so, because within the hour, so it probably was murder, if you call it that. He told Mick Rock that he had 2 guns and ammunition in a hayrick in Clonard Street, and he was ordered to collect them. He returned and gave Mick Rock 1 weapon. They approached the building. They varied in their interpretation of how they approached Mary Smith's bar. Now, I'm going now at this moment in time to quote directly from Michael Rock's account of what happened next when he and Willie Corcoran entered the bar. "I had no gun, but Corcoran got me one, and also one for himself, and he came at me. We went to the back door of the public house where the tans were, and with the guns in our hands entered and ordered them to clear out. Amongst the party of tans who were seemingly unarmed, but who we knew always carried some type of small arms, were 2 head constables, 2 brothers named Burke from Kerry. As we entered, we could see that the tans had hold of a man named Monks, and some other civilians who had been drinking in the pub. When I ordered them to clear out, instead of doing so, they made a rush at me, and I had no option but to fire. I shot one of the head constables dead, and wounded the other, who later recovered. And then my pal and I," meaning Willie Corcoran, "cleared out the back door and got safely away." And he concludes by saying that the Derhams, Lawless, Gibbons and others were warned not to stay at home that night. Now, we know from both of their accounts they didn't immediately leave the town. They weren't necessarily expecting a reprisal, because when Sergeant Finnerty was shot dead in April of that year, yes, there were some raids and some arrests, but nobody was ever charged for his death, and there was no reprisal. They revealed that he went up Dublin Street, down the Market Green, down Pump Lane, and if they met anybody of Republican tendencies, he said, "Look, there might be trouble in Balbriggan tonight. keep our heads down. Now, Michael Rock reveals that yes, he began to wonder, would there be trouble? So he says he got rid of his pistol. He doesn't tell us how. And he cycled up back to the Knoll. Willie Corcoran went home to bed in Clonard Street. And later that night he was roused by his sister Catherine and told the towns around Clonard Street. And of course at this stage he went out the back way. So we know that 1 or 2 hours after the shooting dead of Peter Burke, several lorries came in from Gormanstown camp and parked outside the RSC barracks. And very soon a sergeant with bayonet point, perhaps he might have been black and tan, was seen commandeering tins of petrol from Connellan's garage on Key Street. They then proceeded to Derham's public house. Now they were probably looking for Jimmy Derham himself, but they then proceeded to ransack the house, terrorised the family. The family fled to safety in the Hampton Arms Hotel, but John Derham was made to sit for several hours on the curbside and threatened with execution, intimidated, and they were looking for the names of the people involved. We know this because 6 weeks after the sack of Balbriggan, he accepted an invitation from the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland, travelled to Washington by what was described as a small coastal vessel, and gave verbatim evidence to the American Commission. His testimony was published very, very soon after in a document called Torture and Terror in Ireland. It's a wonderful document and it's available at the National Library of Ireland. 2 other sections in the same document were the torture and execution of Kevin Barry and the burning of Turles. So that's John Derham. Now, they then proceeded over to Connolly's public house, owned by Patrick Connolly, originally from Cavan. They torched and burnt that down. And then, as you can see, they did damage to licensed premise in the corner of Mill Street, which was owned at the time by a Tipperary woman, Anastasia Morrissey. Across the road, James McGlew, town commissioner, his pub wasn't burned, but his shop was damaged as such. You can also see Mary Ann Hall's shop across the road. Mary Ann Hall was a Cavan woman as well. They then proceeded up Clonard Street, which apparently at that time was called Sinn Féin Alley or Sinn Féin Row. And they inflicted major damage to about 30 or 40 dwellings in the street. 6 cottages that had been built by the Rodri Board of Guardians were torched. 6 cottages that had been built by the O'Neill brothers were torched, 12 in all. Damage is done to several houses. People, of course, fled in their numbers, of course, out the back ways, were terrified. They fled up to Clonard Hill, seeking refuge in the ditches, whatever. Some people fled up to the Bower. We're told the next day up to 40 families eventually fled to the safety of Dublin. There was a newspaper article some days later to that effect, that 40 families fled the town, and that Charles Gallen, the owner of Linen Mill in Balbriggan, said that he would pay their expenses for all of the 40 families because their fortnightly rents were not payable until next Friday. And that's Clonard Street as such. And then they proceeded up Drogheda Street, and some suggest then that they were intent on burning the world famous Smith's factory. There are some sources that say that credit for they're not doing that and they're going on and burning an English-owned factory called Deeds Templar was down to the persuasion of Dr. William Fulham. Others said it was Constable Walsh in the RIC. But there is a published document which gives us much more light on the subject. And it's an article that appeared in a Fullbook magazine in the summer of 1971. And it's an interview carried out with a lady called Lily Collins, who at the time of the publication was deceased. But in 1920, she was a young girl, she tells us, sitting or standing in the kitchen with her father, J.J. Collins, in one of the red brick houses on the left side of Key Street, or of Station Street. And he and his next door neighbour, Richard Gorman, had 2 very senior posts in the factory, hence their occupation of those houses. And much to her father's amazement, they heard the noise of the boots of the soldiers coming down the street, and they heard Richard Gorman coming out of the next door with his son, who'd fought in World War I. putting his hand up, remonstrating with the officers, and unbelievably, in her opinion, or her father's opinion, persuading the Crown forces not to touch Smiths. So they proceeded down to the sea banks and ironically built Balbriggan Sea Mills Limited, which is owned by a British company. Now, it said at the time that the factory on the sea banks employed 120 men in the factory and upwards of 200 or more mothers and daughters who worked at home, stitching and embroidering. So a huge amount of employment was lost as such. Now, the next morning, of course, people eventually come down to see what damage had been done. Oh yes, of course, I omitted to say that at the top of Drogheda Street, they also burnt down a premises that was known down as the Milestone Inn, that was owned by Joseph and Teresa McGowan. Now, there are one or two errors, unfortunately, on this diagram. For example, she represents McGowan's as a grocery, but in fact it was a very large public premises as such. And across the road, John Landy, a Louth man, his thatched pub was also burnt to the ground. He wasn't present on the night. And we also have a look, go back maybe to the very little, the original caption in relation to Smith's Public House, where she said the Burke brothers, both RSC, killed by Michael Rock. This error and mistake has been repeated umpteen times over the years, even to this day by certain writers, to the effect that both brothers died. It may have been that that was the initial rumour, but we know that his brother, Peter William Patrick, did survive his wounds, and we discovered recently that in fact, having left the RAC, served in the police in Palestine. But it could be that the word spread to Gormanston that both brothers had died, which might partly explain the determination of the Black and Tans to come into Balbriggan and gain revenge, particularly for the death of this popular and senior instructor, Peter Burke. The next morning, of course, people come down, if they weren't already terrified, to discover, of course, some of their houses are burned to the ground. And one of the reasons that the sack of Balbriggan is considered the most notorious, or one of the most notorious and newsworthy reprisals of the Irish War of Independence was that 20 miles away, with an easy road to reach of road and rail, there were foreign correspondents, British correspondents, French correspondents, Americans based in the Shelbourne Hotel, covering the events of the Irish War of Independence. And they were being very well informed by Sinn Féin propaganda, and they were given access in secret to Sinn Féin leaders. And a lot of them descended on the town within 24 hours. The Drogheda Independent reporter arrived by train the very next day and contributed a fantastic article that week to the Drogheda Independent, complete with photographs. Representatives or reporters who weren't named in those days from the Irish Times, which is essentially pro-unionist, Irish Independent, pro-nationalist, and other papers as well. Like English newspapers like the Daily Mail were represented. Hugh Martin was the Robert Simpson of the time, and he was come down. So in fact, within a week, newspaper coverage and photographs of the ruined town appeared throughout Great Britain and also America. So that contributed to the representation of what happened in Balbriggan. I think we'll move on, Killian. Now we're going to have a look at some of the buildings then and now. The first building, of course, that we heard about was John Durham's premises. Was rebuilt, and as we can see here by the capture in 1922, there was a marvellous article researched by Professor David Fitzpatrick in a book called Terror in Ireland, whereby he traced 71 compensation claims paid out to 71 people from Balbriggan over a period of years. It's a wonderful work of research. He went through Ursa Figule, he looked at 1901, 1911 census, he looked at the status of the people concerned, the original claims and then the reduced claims. So we know, for example, that eventually £83,000 sterling was paid out in the early 1920s by the British Treasury in conjunction with the Provisional Republic of Ireland. and that more than half of the 83,000 went to the owners of Balbriggan Siemens Limited. They got 45,000. Patrick Connolly got 7,500 and John Derham got 7,000. But it looks as if John Derham was paid in advance because of his status, because he was able to rebuild his premises in 1922. Now we're looking at premises, modern premises now in Hampton Street, called Hampton Court, but it was on this site that John Gibbons lived. Now, on the night in question, on September 1920, two men were pulled out of their houses. John Gibbons, aged 27, a bachelor dairy farmer, living with his aged sister and three unmarried sisters. He was pulled out of his house that stood in his premises and brought down to the barracks. And also, James Lawless was pulled out of his house and shop across the road from the hotel. James Lawless at the time was 41 years of age, married with 8 young children. They were both volunteers. And we know at dawn, the following morning, their bodies were found on the corner of Key Street and Mill Street. People put blankets on their bodies, took them across the road to Keeling's yard. And now we're looking at a building still standing now, and of course this was the site of John Landy's originally attached premises. But as we can see, it was rebuilt in 1923. And when you look at it architecturally, it almost is a fine example of an Art Deco building. Thank you. We're back down Bridge Street, and we're looking at the site of a modern building built by Joe Keeling, a member of the Keeling family. But originally, his parents had a shop there in a dairy, and it was into a yard on this location that the two bodies were brought across the road. And thanks to Mrs. Keeling of Chapel Street, we have this recently acquired photograph of the original shop, and that's Mrs. Bridget Keeling, wife of Christy Keeling. And we believe, and this is taken in the early to mid-30s, and we have the two sons, Joe and Bill Keeling, standing. And Bill Keeling, years later, when he was retired, became a very, very good friend of Balbriggan Historical Society and donated some wonderful slides he took of Balbriggan and one day in 1962, which included the Corpus Christi procession and the blessing of the boats. Thank you. And this is a current building just standing in Bridge Street, and that's where James Lawless was working and living. 41, 8 young children. He married Mary Ann Woodhead in 1899 in St. Peter and Paul's Church in Balbriggan. And in April 1923, according to David Patrick's research, the Gibbons family and the Lawless family finally received a compensation. The Gibbons family received £500. Mary Ann Woodhead received £1,750, £800 for herself and the rest for the family. And we're indebted to Mary English, her granddaughter, who informed us that shortly after that, Mary Ann Woodhead opened up a shop for years on their premises, run by herself and her daughter, Una Lawless. She never spoke about the events of September 1920, and eventually she endowed 5 members of her family to go to America to make a life for themselves. Thank you. Back up and draw the street, and again, of course, this is the present building, the Milestone Inn, which is on the site of the original Gladstone Inn. In relation to the Gladstone Inn, there's a story that May and I might remember. In 1983 and 1984, we organised a week-long exhibition in the Market House. And as we were putting our items together, Jack Kennedy, a former town commissioner, arrived and produced an invaluable object in his opinion. He said at the age of 7, he walked through the rubble of the Milestone and he found an undamaged glass which bore the imprint Gladstone in Balbriggan. And at his request, we exhibited that during the 2 exhibitions. And it's still in the possession of his son, I believe. Thank you. Yeah. Down on Bridge Street here, now we're looking at a building that used to be called the Young Men's Catholic Association. But it was in this premises, on this building, where the RIC were based in 1920. We believe that it was a district station. At the time, it may have had between 12 and 20 constables, several sergeants, and a district inspector who at the time was actually District Inspector Hunter. It was into this building that night that John Gibbons and James Lawless were brought in for questioning. It may be that while they were in the custody of the local RIC, they were relatively safe. It would appear that sometime during the night they were released to the custody of the Blackened Hands, which sealed their fate, unfortunately. This is one of the images that Killian has taken from Michael Barry's book. This is an example of a crossy tender, shielded by armour plate, which transported the auxiliaries. And it should be said at this stage, the British government were so concerned by the loss of morale and the loss of men in the RIC that in early 1920 they decided to recruit 2 bands of mercenaries or temporary police cadets to come to Ireland. So from March 1920, groups of men that were later called the Blackened Hands came to Dublin, Beggars Bush, Phoenix Park, eventually in August came to Gormanstown. After initial training, they were dispersed to the barracks throughout the country. They were men who, some of them had seen service in World War II, World War I, I apologise. They couldn't get employment in post-war Britain. They were seeking adventure. They were offered the princely sum of 10 shillings per week, food and clothing, generous annual leave allowances. And they were sent out to respective barracks throughout the country, but there was a culture clash and had nothing in common whatsoever with the native-born Irish RIC men, which led to more resignations. And they quickly became, in Ireland, known for their, I suppose, their behaviour. Often drunken, often, I suppose, intimidating people in the streets of Balbriggan and throughout Ireland. Now, another group of men called the auxiliaries were recruited in July of that year. It's reckoned, by the way, that about 9,200 Blackened Hands eventually came to Ireland. But in July, it was decided to augment them with men of a slightly different calibre. Men were recruited in Great Britain who had reached the status of officer class in World War I. These men had been promoted in the field for bravery or leadership. They were from working class and middle class origins and had shown initiative and bravery on the field. These became temporary police cadets with the rank of sergeant. They were offered £1 a week. They were heavily armed with bandoliers, pistols, carbines, distinguished by their Balmoral bonnets. They were formed into bands of 100 men with Ford cars and were heavily motorised. And they were much more dangerous than the Blackened Hands. Thank you. And this was the site of Pat Connolly's original premises on the corner of Mill Street. Thank you. And again, this is the present streetscape as it looks now. Very little has changed on Bridge Street. It's really very, very difficult to understand what it was like when they rode into Balbriggan that night at about 11 o'clock. Thank you. And Killian then went around Balbriggan and photographing various signs. The people of Balbriggan were very, very thankful, particularly to Surgeon William Francis Fulham. And 2 areas were named after him shortly after that, Fulham Street and Fulham Terrace. And in the mid-1930s, 2 terraces, namely Gibbons Terrace and Lawless Terrace, were built to commemorate James Lawless and John Gibbons. And Durham Park was erected in the 50s, I take it, to represent the contribution of John Durham Sr. and Jimmy Durham. Thank you. This is an iconic photograph which appears in lots of publications, and it's looking down Clonard Street from Clonard Hill. Obviously it shows some of the thatched cottages that had been burnt to the ground. People are beginning to move around, and when this is displayed by the society some years ago, some people are of the opinion that the gentleman walking up the street with the horse and cart might have been a man called Mr. Matthews from the top of Clonard Hill, but we're not sure. Compensation was paid out to the people who are living, the lessees, if you like, of 11 of the cottages. Now, of course, they lost their house. I had to find, and they would have been large families. So 11 claimants were paid compensation. Thank you. Another photograph that appears in this appeared in the Daily Graphic, and it shows presumably an entire family having to move elsewhere for accommodation. I often say it's most unusual. In my father's time, a man was never seen carrying his child in his arms, but presumably this is the wife and the other members carrying their sole belongings to other accommodation. The flour mill on Dublin Street was soon pressed into use as a hostel or a place of refuge, and bed and bedding was brought down from the workhouse at Balloch. Photograph taken of the interior of Balbriggan Seamen's Limited. Now, we've heard about the Commission into Conditions in Ireland that was formed in America, and they were concerned about conditions. They heard the verbatim evidence of people like John Derham and the sister of Terence McSweeney. They came to Ireland in the second week in February of 1921. The first locations they visited were Balbriggan, Skerries and Croke Park. And there are photographs of them in Clonard Street. Now, a second body was instituted sometime previously in 1919. And there was a British Labour Commission appointed to look into conditions in Ireland. Somewhat later they came to Ireland, and this is a photograph of members of this commission in the ruins of Deeds Templars inspecting the premises. Both commissions published the reports of their inquiries, and they're both available online. We know that the American Commission set up an Irish White Cross Society to protect their probity, and that eventually 4,000 sterling was decided upon for Balbriggan to encourage business initiatives in the town rather than going to specific individuals. Thank you. This, very soon, subscription campaigns were set up. Within days, a subscription committee was set up and met daily in the town hall. Drogheda, the neighbouring town of Drogheda, adopted Balbriggan as a relief town. This is a copy of an original leaflet relating to this committee, the names of the committee, and some of the early inscriptions. And we look at this because, in fact, a lot of these people, shall we say, were very influential members of the town as such. Lewis White was the owner of, well, I suppose he was the managing director of a Smith's factory, and a well-known unionist. And in fact, the day after the sack of Balbriggan, he, with Dr. Fulham, parish priest of Balbriggan, and Director Jemison, Reverend Canon Eugene Byrne, Reverend William Jemison, rector, the four of them motored into Dublin the very next day, and they met Sir John Anderson, the Under Secretary for Ireland, and expressed their outrage at the events of the previous day and were looking for reparation. So they showed great initiative within a day of the sack of Balbriggan. S.J. Moorhead was a local banker. Charles J. Gallen, who you know now, was the owner of Gallen's Mills. Richard Gorman was the man I mentioned earlier. He was the man that Lily Collins reckoned should get credit for moving the troops on to the sea banks. Reverend Canon Eugene Byrne was very involved in the events at the time. Two curates were William Murphy and Edmund O'Sullivan. Phil Curran, County Councillor, William Fulham, the doctor. W.L.B. Corcoran is mentioned in David Patrick's article, and he reckons, and David Patrick used the term himself, he made a killing. This man had only moved into Balbriggan from Ballyborough 2 years earlier and represented all 71 claimants and got a commission on each compensation paid. William Bannon at the bottom was the clerk of Balbriggan Town Commissioners and lived at Kincora down in High Street. Thomas Cashel we've heard about before. William J. Cummiskey. The Cummiskey family were a prominent business family in the community. Town Commissioners, they had a brickworks, they had a bakery, they had a coal yard. Francis Tundra, I believe, may have lived at Blackhall. Captain Woods, Milverton. Captain Taylor, Ardgillan. Michael Sharkey and Joseph Sharkey, local businessmen, who had a brickworks on the hill of Clonard, and who, ironically, in August of 1920, had sold their entire concern. Phil Wright owned what was called the apothecary or the chemist shop. A. Graham was Archdale Graham, brother of Charles Graham. Archdale Graham at one stage was chairman of Balbriggan Town Commissioner. Michael O'Rourke from Balbriggan. He was at one stage a boss of Spicer's factory and then appointed court clerk, and eventually with his daughter ran an unemployment exchange in Balbriggan. Paddy Daly, a noted local historian of his time, Also, he was in charge of Spice's Bakery for years. William Butler was the principal of the old schools in Chapel Street and was the man that John Gaynor in his deposition gave credit to for encouraging an interest in Irish history as such. And to take J.A. Douglas to have been the principal of St. George's School in Hampton Street, which is for children of the Protestant denomination. Thank you. And this is a list of the people who contributed, and of course starting with Reverend Dr. Walsh, Archbishop of Dublin, and people led from the front, Louis White, Reverend Canon Bourne, and all the way down, some members of the Cummiskey and Murphy family, etc. And thank you. Now, one person I didn't mention who was directly involved in the sack of Balbriggan. People said afterwards that a man called Jack Straw, an English ex-serviceman who was said to be lodging with a Mrs. Rose Donnelly in Key Street, was seen going around Balbriggan and pointing out houses known Republicans to the Black and Tan and auxiliaries. Now, it is said that next day he was seen in Skerries with 2 loaded revolvers in broad daylight, was chased out of Skerries by Republicans. Shortly after, he was captured by local volunteers in the Hill of Clonard, taken to McNally's barn. His body was found. He was interrogated and executed. He was body was found on 21st of October in a place called Bettyville, in a drain, and there was an inquest, a court of inquiry into his identity and cause of death. We shall see here that O'Nowan found about 20th. Which one am I looking here? Gunshot wounds by. Yeah. Yeah. Unknown found dead 21st of October near Bettyville. Medical evidence cannot say how long dead. Gunshot wounds by persons unknown who committed unlawful murder. Now, recently I came across emails sent to our committee in 2012 which shed new light on his possible identity. They came from an English historian called David Grant. He developed an amazing amount of research into the possible identity of this man, who was called Jack Straw originally, but we now know was William Straw. And he's narrowed them down to a man called Percy William Straw, born in the suburb of Nottingham in the 1890s, who joined the Seaforth Highlanders in 1914, who rose to the rank of captain by 1918 in the army, served in Mesopotamia and Egypt, was wounded in 1918 and lost a leg. And all his details match the details known about this man. And David Grant thinks he might have been one of 80 spies based in Ireland, ex-officer class, run by a man called Basil Thompson from Scotland Yard, and answerable only to him, so that their identities would not be easily found out by Michael Collins and his accomplices. And that the last application from this man, Straw, was in April of 1920. The age matches, the military history matches. But the problem is, if he lost a leg, as David Grant thinks, in 1918, nobody mentions in any of the sources that he walked with a limp. How did he get to Skerries, etc. But it's an interesting story, and I often wonder, could it be followed up in Nottingham? David Grant, by looking up through British records, only discovered 2 men in the entirety of Great Britain of the same name and their death certificates, but they don't match that particular age. Thank you. We're very indebted to members of the Committee of Glenamaddy Arts and Historical Society. I emailed them last year. For several years, we approached members of the Burke family, still living in the family home outside Glenamaddy. And some years ago, one of our then committee members and current trustee, Jerry MacDonald, spoke to them. We discovered some members of the family did not want to discuss it, and some did. It would appear that when the body of Peter Burke was brought back to Glenamaddy and was buried in the family plot, that local Republicans put pressure on the family not to participate because he was seen as a member of the Crown Forces. But I'm just delighted to say that after representations from the Glenamaddy Committee, I received these two photographs for the first time of Peter Burke and William Burke as young men in civilian clothes. So they're a valuable record to have. And we know, of course, that Peter died at the age of 33, unmarried, bachelor, of course. Now, both families received compensation as well. That's all, thank you. This is, there are several images now of the police record of Peter Burke. Now, one thing that mystifies me, his date of birth is given as 1884, and that means that he would have been 36 in 1920, but yet the date on his grave is 33, height 5'10", Galway, Catholic. Yeah, originally a farmer, the various places where he served: Antrim, Tipperary, Kerry Reserve, promoting sergeant 1915, promoted sergeant 1918, promoted head constable 9th of August 1919. And the final part of that, of course, murdered in Balbriggan 20th of the 9th, 1920. Now, I mentioned Mary Lawless, Mary English before. On the right lives in Lochshinny with her artist husband, James English, the granddaughter of James Lawless. And each member of the current Lawless family are in possession of this family portrait. So she allowed Cillian to take a photograph. And this was James Lawless, a young man. And that's, of course, Mary there. So, of course, I omitted to say that 3 days after their death, they were removed to Balscadden Cemetery, where they now lie, Gibbons and Lawless. Now, I'm indebted to Frank Whirity, who has presented this recently to the Archives Historical Society. And it's a photograph dated 1924, 4 years after the sack of Balbriggan. It's of the O'Dwyer's local Gaelic football team, who were only founded as recently as 1919. And Willie Corcoran, who I mentioned earlier, is marked here in the front row. He would have been 26 at the time, 4 years after the sack of Balbriggan. And we can identify all of the members of that team as such. On the back left, I'll just mention one or two. In civilian clothes was a man called Frank Kennedy, member of the Kennedy family, and for many years he covered for the Drogheda Independent sporting activities under the pseudonym of Ken O'D. And that's his brother Hugh, who was secretary of the club at the time. And Phil, the man on the right-hand side, was Phil Curran, who later became a county councillor. Two men in the front had nicknames. Balbriggan and his wife had nicknames. They were called the Boggy Smith and the Gigi Knight, Patrick Smith and George Knight. And some of the early articles from the 1930s I found by Frank Kennedy. Bob Monks, fourth from left in the back row, and George Knight are singled out for their prowess. Thank you. Now, this is an earlier photograph taken in 1911 of the Knoll hurling team, which had been founded in 1909. And second from the left in the front row is a young Michael Rock. Now, we know that Michael Rock was on the run for the rest of the Irish War of Independence. And the 2nd of July, he was cycling towards Old Town, according to his deposition. He was passed by two lorries full of black and tans. Cycling nonchalantly past him, one RIC member spotted him. He was shot twice, once in the hip and once in the arm. He was brought to the Coast Guard station in Balbriggan, where he was attended by Dr. Fulham. He was then brought to the George's Military Hospital in Dublin, now St. Bricken's, and he thought he was about to be hanged, but he was saved by the truce on the 11th of July 1921. He didn't leave hospital until Christmas of that year. He took no further involvement in the Irish Civil War. He married May Browning in Damastown in 1925. She died in 1937. He then married Rosaline Howard. He had an undertaker's business in Swords. This is continued by his grandson, Michael, as well. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life because of his wounds. he was very involved with Fingallon's Gaelic Football Club. He died in 1969, aged 83. This is just a general shot we took from the book, showing scenes at a time when people were on hunger strike. The huge crowds, particularly when Padre Clancy had led the hunger strike in the Mountjoy jail over 2 days in April. This was the sort of furore that the strike. But unbelievably, on the second day, the British government relented and all the strikers were released from jail. Photograph of General Sir Neville Mccready. Now, he was a former commissioner of the police in London. Somewhat strangely, the government appointed him in charge of the army in Ireland in early 1920. April, he refused to take control of the police. He had no respect for their competence or their discipline. Thank you. And now, I mentioned earlier on Sir John Anderson. It's a big shake-up in early 1920 in Dublin Castle. A lot of the senior civil servants were removed and sent over to sort things out, where in the middle Sir John Anderson, considered the most able Under-Secretary or civil servant of his time. He's third from the right. Third from left, my apologies. Then to his right, second from the left, was a man called Andy Cope, most unusual, an ex-policeman, ex-excise man, but he was his, shall we say, he was his right-hand man, and he was given the task of behind the scenes negotiating with senior Sinn Féin figures. And in fact, he's so successful that after formation of the provisional government, he was kept on in Dublin Castle. The man on the left was a man called Mark Sturgis, from a different social background, ex-Etonian, ex-Oxfordian. And in effect, his unpublished diaries are now accessible. And in his diaries, he makes one scathing reference to Balbriggan, which he describes as a sink. Next. Now, on the left, we have Sir Hammer Greenwood, Canadian-born, who was the Chief Secretary at the time with his wife, Lady Wife. And the right, General Sir Henry Tudor, an ex-military man, who was given control of the unarmed DMP, the armed RIC, and eventually control of the Black and Tans. He wasn't in control of the auxiliaries. A man called Brigadier Percy Crozier took that order or that instruction on, but he was so disgusted with the indiscipline of the auxiliaries that within months Crozier resigned. And here's an example of an enrollment brochure for the auxiliaries. Joined the auxiliary division of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Ex-officers with first-class record are eligible, etc., etc. Recruiting officers, Great Scotland Yard. They were officially called temporary cadets, or they were also called ADRIC, Auxiliary Division. And we've already mentioned their unique uniform and bonnets. Thank you. This would be a very early photograph of some of the earliest Black and Tan recruits who originally came into Beggar's Bush in Dublin. And reference is made in the caption here. There weren't enough uniforms to go around, particularly constabulary uniforms, so they wore dark green tunics and khaki trousers and various assortments of caps. And because of that, they were actually called the Black and Tans, which apparently took its name from a group of hounds, hunting hounds in County Limerick. Thank you. And this again is a sort of an enrollment postcard of the time for these various personnel as such. Thank you. This is what I suppose a temporary cadet or auxiliary looked from close up. As you can see, he's wielding a Winchester pump action shotgun. Now, I mentioned earlier there was huge newspaper coverage for several days and weeks afterwards. And the Irish Times and some of the pro-unionist papers tended not to use, shall we say, very extreme wording. So their first article on the subject used the terms terrible outbreak in Balbriggan, sequel to murder of a head constable, town partially destroyed by fire, etc., etc. The Irish Independent would be slightly more nationalist as such. These are photographs and captions taken from the Daily Graphic from September the 23rd, as we can see. two photographs we've already seen of Clonard Street. The building here in the centre is the original Connolly's premises. That is, the inset is, and enlarged, is a photograph of the young John Gibbons. And I take the lower photograph. This appeared in one or two documents. That building was Landy's thatched premises. And two families lost their houses during the fire. A family called Dowling were adjacent to the Gladstone, and a family called Seaver lost their house adjacent to Landy's. So perhaps these are the Seaver family leaving with all of their belongings. This is a most unusual photograph, which perhaps unique, which appeared in the Drogheda Independent. And the caption states, as the funerals of Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons passed the police barracks en route to Bilscatton Cemetery, RIC members come out and salute. I'm not in a position to say whether that's unique, but I would have considered it most extraordinary that members of the RIC would stand to attention at the funeral of Republicans, but perhaps because a lot of them had served here and knew both men well, it could explain their actions. Now, just as an example of how internationally the subject of the sack was represented, this is actually a depiction from the front cover of an Italian journal called La Tribuna Illustrata. And it's a supplement dated 28th November to the 5th of December. And as you can see, it's a colour illustration based on a photograph showing three Balbriggan women walking past with their belongings. And Killian kindly had the Italian caption translated. And it reads, the population of the Irish town of Balbriggan leave their homes, carrying the furniture and household goods that they could salvage after the sacking of the English troops. Thank you. Now, I spoke about international coverage, and I mentioned two unique accounts by Willie Corcoran and Michael Rock. There's another unique account taken on the very same next morning on the streets of Balbriggan by this man. It has never been published in English. I was given a copy last year by a former president of our society and treasurer, Pauline O'Hare. And several years ago, while she was in France, she came across a French article by this journalist in 1955. It represented his findings when he arrived in Balbriggan on the Tuesday morning of 1921. It deserves to be published in full if ever we publish a comprehensive book. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to just tell you a little about his memory of the morning in question. He says he got a phone call from the head of the propaganda unit of Sinn Féin. He said, get down to Balbriggan, something's happened. He said, where's Balbriggan? It's a small town, some 20 miles away. He traced, or he got a taxi. He said he took, the car was very ancient, the road, it took him forever. Describes the countenance of the taxi driver as freckled. As he nears the town, he can see the straw-filled roofs of the houses. But then when he gets into the centre of Balbriggan and Bridge Street, and he sees the scenes of destruction and terror, he compares it to scenes he had witnessed in France during World War I. He used to send his articles over to Le Petit Journal in Paris. Now, he led a charmed life. He was raised in Argentina, educated in France, served as a pilot in World War I, survived, became a crusading journalist afterwards, and was one of 3 journalists in Dublin at the time. In World War II, he then actually, after his career as a journalist was over, he actually fought for the Free French Army with a bomber squadron in England and survived that. And then after that, he became a well-known journalist and novelist. And one of his novels became a film. It was directed by Louis Bonwell in 1967. It starred the famous French actress Catherine Deneuve. It was called Belle de Jour. His name was Joseph Cassel. But at a very young age, he witnessed the destruction and the scenes of chaos the next morning. And he says the taxi driver departed, brought back a man in black who spoke to Joseph Cassel directly. introduced himself as a curate named O'Byrne. We now know, of course, he was Canon Eugene Byrne, who expressed his shock and outrage at what happened to a previously peaceful town. And so we look forward to one day perhaps publishing this man's account in full. He lived to the age of 80 and received the Legion of Honour. Now, the following illustrations are taken from the Drogheda Independent over the years as the sack of Balbriggan was celebrated. So the first major anniversary, shall we say, was 21 years later in 1941. And these are photographs taken from the Drogheda Independent at the time, showing a march up George Street towards the church, members of the local Boy Scouts, local, perhaps, public representatives, members of the Landed Defence Forces, and the man standing on the podium was Canon Hickey, the parish priest of the time. And the background was Dunn's Saddlery on George Square. Now we come to 1970, and this is taken from an entire page from the Drogheda Independent, and in September of that year there was an open-air mass held in Balscadden, where Lawless and Gibbons were buried. You can have members of the army standing to attention before firing a volley. And this is Willie Corcoran laying a wreath at the memorial. And at that stage he was 70 years of age, but he was still hale and hearty. Now, luckily enough for us in Balbriggan, the Drogheda Independent was established in 1884. And in 1984 they released a very large, decorative, commemorative, I suppose, paper. I remember buying 2 copies for £1 each in Kitty White's in shop near the library. But lucky enough for us, in their commemorative leaflet, they reprinted 2 entire pages of their original reportage with the original photographs. Now we have seen some of them already, but we can see another one of the exterior of Balbriggan Seamills Limited. And on the bottom right hand side we can see another photograph of the interior of a house on Clonard Street with a local woman and a youth and 3 young children with her. Now this has been extensively researched by local historian Frank Werty, and I believe Frank intends to give a talk in our upcoming seminar on the identity of some people in that particular photograph. And again in 1995, on the 75th anniversary, a journalist called Ciara Ryan came up to the library to me. I gave her some background information on the subject, including the wording of the sack of Balbriggan. But Bill Keeling on the Quiet gave me a photograph that belonged to Joe Keeling. I'd never seen it before, and it's this photograph on the top and enlarged by Killian. And it dates to September 1941, when the memorial was officially unveiled. And I think we're looking at the, shall we say, at least one of the whole array are standing to attention, obviously. Now, the gentleman on the back, we know, of course, was Jack Larkin, a former town commissioner, county councillor, former town commissioner Stephen Lawless, second youngest son of James Lawless, and Brian Purcell, ex-town commissioner as well. And that's Larry Dunn, bandmaster, Balbriggan Brass and Reed Band. And also we have here on the left-hand side a photograph of many of the children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Seamus Lawless standing beside the plaque on Bridge Street. And the middle photograph shows Owen Cullum, who lived in St. Peter's Terrace in Balbriggan, who at the time was the principal of the National School in Balscadden. So on the same day, the same Sunday, he was chosen to lay a wreath in Balscadden. And finally, in 1999, the Drogheda looked back over various events that occurred in Fingal and Balbriggan in the previous millennium and of whatever, and they, in their own wisdom, decided that the most historic and momentous event was indeed the sack of Balbriggan, the biggest story of the century in Fingal. Now we come to some photographs that Killian has recently taken from, I think it's a wonderful document, and I'm being objective. This was a calendar produced 2 years ago by the committee of the Balbriggan District Historical Society, and it features 12 photographs depicting various aspects of the sack. And there were photographs were taken from 3 sources: RTE, Archives, the National Library, but principally from a unique album which is now in the possession of Jim Glennon, ex-TD and ex-Rugby International. The album once belonged to his mother, Jenny. Now, as a young girl, she was Jenny McGowan. She was actually the daughter of Joseph and Teresa McGowan. And he very kindly donated some of the photographs that have appeared in this calendar. Now, this particular photograph we can date to early February 1921, because the caption tells us that 8 men from the American Commission in Ireland were here. The 2 men in front were identified as Clement J. France, and he was supposedly, or allegedly, according to the caption, a lawyer from Seattle. The man beside him was John McCoy. There were 6 other commission members, and the men following behind were local men helping them. Thank you. And these are some of the photographs that appear in the calendar. This is at the bottom of Clonard Street, looking down towards Bridge Street. And these 3 ladies, 2 pushing prams or perambulators, sometimes they're called bassinets. The lady on the right, I believe, may feature in another photograph as well. And you have the onlookers looking on. This is a photograph of the ruined Milestone Inn. And Joseph McGowan is in the centre, outside his ruined premises, the grandfather of Jim Glennon. Here we have Dermot's Public House. Now, of course, the location on the corner of Clonard Street is the Balbriggan Medical Centre. Now, close by, Dr. Fulham lived, but and worked, but his premises were not touched. A general shot at the destruction of some of the buildings at the bottom of Clonard Street. And again, some of the cottages in Clonard Street as well, with some of the people standing outside. Yeah, this is close up of the photograph we referred to earlier. Some years ago, in Balbriggan Library, this photograph was on display. I was behind the adult desk, and a man called Hammond came in. He looked at the photograph, I went over to him, he said, "That's me. That's me second from left, with the fair hair, Mr. Hammond." And he said the 2 boys were called Dunnigan, and one was called Searly. And he said the lady on the right was Ellen Costello. I didn't pursue the subject, but I know that Frank Wherity has, and will present his findings in the seminar. Now we come to the final illustrations, the memorials of the people concerned. And out in Balscadden Cemetery, where several parish priests are buried, we have the memorial to Reverend Eugene D. Cannon Byrne, who died only 4 years later. And we know he did one impressive thing in Balbriggan in 1923. He commissioned 2 stained glass windows by Harry Clark for Balbriggan Church. And they're still there to this day, and they're commented upon by experts in stained glass. But he died in April 1914, I think before the installations of the windows. Okay. Killing went out to Stamullen graveyard and unearthed the inscription in loving memory of William Fulham, MD, who died 26th of December 1934, and his wife Susan, who died 31st of July 1929. Now, this is a photograph of the present memorial in Denham graveyard to Peter Burke. And it tells us that he was actually, 33 years age at the time. And as I said, there's some discrepancy between his details of his date of birth, but I presume the details in the memorial are quite correct. Now, in St. Peter and Paul Cemetery in Balbriggan, which is open in 1929, we had a memorial to William Corcoran, and he's buried with various members of his family. On the bottom, we can see their brother William died 24th of February 1989, Balbriggan Company, 1st Battalion, Fingal Brigade, Old IRA. And in Sword Cemetery, we have the memorial to Michael Rock, in loving memory of May Rock, his first wife, May Brown, who died in 1937. It actually tells us that, 14th of January 1938, aged 37 years. And then Michael died in 1969, aged 83. And now we're indebted to the family of Mary Heaney, recently deceased. She died at the age of 92, living in Dublin Street. And some years ago, she donated a collection of news cuttings to me. And lo and behold, there were 2 pages relating to the burial of Jimmy Derham. And the bottom one depicts his removal in his coffin from the Pro Cathedral in Dublin. Because tragically, he survived the Irish War of Independence. He served twice as a TD on 2 occasions, the early 1920s. He died tragically in 1923 at the age of 27 when he fell down the stairs in Spicer's Bakery while socialising with the owner of the bakery. And these are men, presumably perhaps local members of Balbriggan, perhaps family members, carrying his coffin out. The year is 1923. We believe the gentleman on the left was his father, John Derham. And I think, and I know you're not supposed to speculate for presentations such as this, but the man on the right facing John Derham suspiciously looks to me like a very young Sean Lemass. And Killian located the memorial stone of John Derham and his wife Margaret and their son Michael James, and they're not buried in Balbriggan. They're buried in Home Patrick in Skerries. And here you see 20 November 1923, aged 27 years. And of course we come to Balscadden Cemetery, and we're looking at the details on the memorial, which I believe were unveiled in September 1941. Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons, who were brutally done to death by British forces while in their custody on the occasion of the sack of Balbriggan, 20 September 1920. Faithful and uncompromising sons of Ireland, their names shall live in the grateful remembrance of the people. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. Pierce, Patrick Pierce, Ar Yeshde Gorevananum. 2 plots down lie Seamus Lawless's wife Mary Ann and her daughter Una. And our final illustration is, of course, the plaque on Bridge Street in the middle of Balbriggan, unveiled again in September of 1941, and near the spot Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons were brutally done to death by British forces while in their custody 20th of September 1920, Ar Yeshde Gorevananum. I think that concludes our presentation.